Thanks, Dave. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New Zealand Warbirds. Hopefully while you're here, you get a chance to have a look around some of our aircraft and such like. Dave asked me to stand up and speak to you folks, and I sort of said to him, well, what do you want? Do you just want to chat or a ramble or something? And he gave me a list. And so now I've got some paper and a list and a ramble. So hopefully we can enjoy it. As Dave says, I've been lucky enough to fly quite a few number of exotic aircraft, and I thought as a lead into that, I'd start to explain as how did it all happen. How did a young kid from small town New Zealand, a bit bigger than Cambridge, Thames, I think, get to fly all these things? And it starts as a kid, basically, as some of you may remember a time when people used to lean across the fence and talk to neighbours and what have you. Well, our neighbour was a chap by the name of Dick Farger. He was nobody special. He was the local milk vendor, if you can remember when people used to go out at night and deliver milk to your back doorstep and stuff. And he had a dream of being a pilot. He was a PPL and he was trying hard to get a CPL and had visions of joining National Airways Corporation as it was at the time. And so my dad's and Dick's conversations piqued my interest, and it ended up Dick took me for a ride in an aeroplane. I thought, oh, this is not too good, not too bad at least. And so he impressed upon me, young lad, if you want to become a pilot, you've got to join the Air Force. And so as probably a 12 or 13-year-old, I sort of set my sights about, well, how do I get to join this Air Force thing? And it started off with an Air Training Corps and what have you, which was very instrumental, I guess, because it introduced me to Air Force, and I was lucky enough to get an ATC flying scholarship. So it all worked out quite well, so that on the 6th of January 1970, I headed down to Wigram to join 170 pilots course. And of course, those pilots courses were held on the Harvard, and outdated and obsolescent as it was named the pilot trainer or the pilot maker in World War II, and nothing had changed. And so during my Air Force career, which stretched out to some 16 years, a lot longer than I ever expected it to be, I ended up at PDS and then CFS and got involved with the Red Checkers, which was the first air trainer aerobatic team, led at the time by Frank Sharp. And so that really set the basis for where I ended up. Our first display in that team was at Nelson, and I think I managed to stay in formation most of the time. And our biggest display we had was 1981 Air Force Day at Ohakea. My most memorable memory from that event was watching this thing called an F-15 Eagle take off in about 50 metres and climb vertically to about 20,000 feet. And of course our involvement in the Red Checkers. So anyway, moving on, after my Air Force career I joined Air New Zealand, and as luck would have it, on my friendship simulator training, my instructor was one Keith Skilling, who I'm sure you've all heard about. And by the end of, Keith was telling us about this Harvard project he had and how they were looking out for another member and how I really needed to get involved. And by the end of that training session, I was a part owner of Harvard 57, which was under reconstruction. And the sucker line was it's going to be ready in 6 months or so for the next Wanaka. And we've priced it out to the last cent. It's going to be $160,000. We've already spent $60,000, so there's only 100 to go. There's, I think, 12 of us in it. Pennies, chicken feed. You're a rich airline pilot. Won't cost you anything. So anyway, 5 years later, and about $360,000 later, just a slight overrun, Harvard 57 got going. But now I had a horse to play with. And so my next lucky break came around about 2003, I guess it was, when Gavin Trethewey came to me and says, Frank, I'm looking for some guys to join the Roaring Forties, and I know you've got a Harvard, and I know you've done this formation stuff, so are you interested? And of course that was the beginning of the end, if you like. So as we went around the different air shows and things in the Roaring Forties and our little old Harvards, I used to look at awe at these big boys and these big aeroplanes and all the magical stuff they could do. I'm thinking of Breitling fighters and such like, old... And so one day in my airline career, I was in Cairns, and I went up to Mariba, which is a little airfield, an old World War II airfield at the back of Cairns, and I saw this P40 and T28 come scorching in and do a lovely buzz and break. I thought, wow, that looks all right. And then the real big break came when Garth Hogan owned Currawong. And Garth, the short story is, he just got this eye-watering insurance bill, and he thought, crikey, I'm not sure that I'm enjoying this airplane enough to pay that bill. So to subsidise that, he allowed a few people to fly his aircraft. Invited, I should say, a few people to fly his aircraft. And so one night, Friday night, I was in the the Auckland Aero Club. No, it was the airline flying club at that stage, where the Auckland Aero Club is now, in the bar, which used to be quite a social scene on a Friday evening. And I was chatting to Garth. And I said, finally got brave enough, he says, bought him a beer and says, Garth, I understand that you're letting a few people fly the P40. What do I have to do? And I don't know if you know Garth Hogan, but he's a very straight up man. He says, well, first of all, you've got to ask me. And so with trepidation, I said, well, I'm asking. And a little bit more luck. He said, well, there's another guy who wants to do a rating, so I'll get John Lamont up there and we'll see what we can do. And so I managed to get a rating in the P40. And so Garth would let me fly it on occasion. I had to tell him 2 days in advance, and it had to be suitable weather, and then he was very strict, as he should have been. And paid him a fortune for it, I thought, which looking back was actually a pittance. And then one day he says, Frank, I've got this guy to go for a ride. Can you take him for a ride for me? And so I did. I took this chap for a ride, and then one ride turned into another ride, turned into another ride, and etc. And so started a 15-year association, if you like, with Currawong. I think one of the neatest things I did with Currawong was take a World War II pilot, his name is Bluey, I think, but he came from Perth, and he'd actually flown that aircraft in New Guinea in World War II. And so we went for a bit of a spin, and he came back, and in true Australian fashion, he said, oh yeah, I guess 80 years between P40 flights ain't too bad. Another memorable occasion, of course, was taking Brian Cox for a spin in it. And the aircraft had dual controls, and I let Brian have a little fly out here, and he sort of did a loop and a roll and I think it's all right, a loop and a roll, etc., just like he'd been flying it yesterday. So the next opportunity came along was Doug Brooker bought and imported a Spitfire. Just a bit of competition out there for a few seconds. Just to explain, the Scout has got a Larone rotary in it, and it's got a very, very basic carburation system. So max RPM on a good day is 1200, and you can throttle it back to about 600, and then you get all that coughing and sneezing and what have you carrying on. All right, back to the story. So next big break came along, and it was Doug Brooker who got a Spitfire. And he came to me and he says, Frank, he says, I think the CFI Warbirds should really have a Spitfire rating. And I was the CFI Warbirds at the time. And I tried to sort of disguise my enthusiasm. And so there it was. I was able to get a Spitfire rating once again from Keith Skilling. And the Spitfire led to doing Part 115 rides and transits, etc., and a few type ratings over, I think it was 8 or 9 years. And so that was just a real opportunity. And the next one that came along is over at Pioneer, Garth Hogan's place at the time. They're rebuilding a Yak 3 aircraft over there, which was the one that had a misfortune at Wanaka a few years ago. And the CAA required this aircraft to have 10 hours test flying. So John Lamont came up from Wanaka to go do the initial test flight on it, because John was Garth's chosen pilot. And John said, look, I'm really quite busy doing other stuff down there. He says, Frank, you can fly this thing if you like. And I thought, isn't that terrible? Somebody's got to fly 10 hours in a Yak 3. And and a lot of it was, there's quite a test flying schedule we had to go through, see how it performed and see how it stalled and see how it did this and yeah. But it turned out a lot of, the last sort of 5 hours of that was just not quite hooning around in the aircraft, but extending the envelope, if you like. And I'll talk a little bit more about the aeroplanes shortly. And then another oddball came along, must have been about 10 years ago now. There's a Focke-Wulf replica, 190 replica, imported at Omaka. And they wanted a test pilot for that. And once again, the big boys were busy. And so Graham Orphan, who looks after that aircraft, came and he says, Frank, he says, any interest in flying this Focke-Wulf 190 thing? And once again, I had to disguise my enthusiasm. And Focke-Wulf, funny old story, is years ago, I'd had this dream of building an aeroplane, and I decided I wanted to build a Focke-Wulf 190. And there was a guy called Marcel Jurka, who's a Frenchman, who had drawn plans for building them out of wood, and putting a 1340 in it. And I thought that was a pretty good idea. But I decided if I hadn't started doing that by the time I was age 50, it was going to be too late, because I'd seen so many projects which were going to be done in 2 years and took 20. And probably, fortunately, along came Currawong, which sort of put that out of my mind. But anyway, here I was, opportunity to fly a Focke-Wulf 190. I thought, gee, how do you do this? And so I sort of researched the internet and what have you. And there's a few bits and pieces there, but not a whole lot. Of course, there's only one or two of these things that are flying recently. So I managed to get hold of Steve Hinton, who's Mr. Warbirds USA, by email, and told him I had this aircraft I wanted to fly, and I knew that he'd flown one. Did he have any tips for me? And I think I got a one line. He says, yeah, it's just another World War II airplane. So that wasn't much use. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Focke-Wulf shortly. And so next one that came along was, I was good friends with Graham Bethel, obviously, for many years. And we talked about, well, how would Graham like to fly a Kitty Hawk, and how would Liz and I like to fly a Mustang? And so that came about. So we did reciprocal type ratings, if you like. And of course the Mustang then once again led on to 115 rides and a few demonstrations. And the next one to come along, which probably almost the last, I think, was Pioneer were rebuilding a P-39 Air Cobra. And once again, that piqued my interest, because as a kid building radio control models, not radio control line models, is I built a P-39. I must say its flying career was pretty limited. I think I got a few flights out of it before it became matchsticks. Never mind. And so once again, it was, well, how do we go about flying a P-39? It was into the internet, see whatever you could find out about it. There's lots of information there. There's pilot's notes. There's all sorts of stuff you can get, but there's very little hard stuff about how you do this. And so it was sit in the aircraft, get the feel for it, find out where things were, and figure out how it's all going to work, do a few ground runs, and eventually you get brave and on the runway and off you go. And probably the most recent one is Mike Jones' Corsair. Now, I'd been looking at the Corsair from when I first got embarked in the Roaring Forties 20 odd years ago, thinking, wow, that looks pretty cool. And so I'm sure you know the history. The airplane had been laid up for some years, and Mike got involved with it. And so it needed a little bit of a test flying. And so we did that down at Marston under the tutelage of Keith Skilling once again. Amazing how these names keep popping up, isn't it? And we got brave enough to go flying in the Corsair, and subsequently it had some major maintenance done, and so I've been fortunate enough to be able to fly the Corsair around and do a number of displays in it. So of all that sort of background of that's how it happened, the question I most get is, well, how do they compare? And they're all very similar, but all very different. And I guess if I just go through them one by one in layman's terms, is the P40, it's a 1936 design. And so equate that to a 1936 Chevy. She's pretty manual and basic. You've got to control the radiator shutters, you've got to control the oil shutters, there's hands and feet all over the place. But having said that, the cockpit, I call it an American cockpit, in that they had actually thought about things. So everything you want to grab is in the right place for the right hand, or the left hand, as the case may be. Flying it, I can just call it, it's a big Harvard, and I liken most of these aeroplanes to Harvards. It's an honest aeroplane. If you're doing manoeuvres and you're getting close to the stall, it gives you a nice little buffet. And so you can feel a little shake going, and that's really telling you, if you keep doing that, I'm going to bite you. And so you know when to back off with it. It's all to do with the design of the aircraft. If you look at the P-40, it's got this big rounded leading edge wing, which does that sort of stuff for you. It's actually, people say if you read the books from World War II, it was a real slug. But it was a real slug at altitude because it didn't have it had supercharging, not great supercharging. So above about 15,000 feet, it got asthmatic. But in the European theatre, that was no good. In the Pacific theatre, it was no problem because the Pacific War was flying pretty much below 15,000, 20,000 feet, often down at sea level. It's a rugged aeroplane. It's built like the old proverbial brick shithouse, and it can take a lot of damage. And the Aussies found in New Guinea and the Americans and throughout the islands that it was just a really rugged aeroplane. Probably my highlight in the P-40, apart from taking old Bluey for a spin, was when Garth rebuilt it. He had this dream of having an aeroplane with 6 operating machine guns in it, and we eventually achieved that. And so a couple of times at Wanakas we were able to load the guns up with blank ammunition, unfortunately, and let them rip. And as soon as the guns went into the aeroplane, it gave it a whole new personality, a whole new persona. Suddenly it went from an aeroplane that looks pretty on the canvas or pretty to look at to actually a war machine. And that's what it was built for. It was built to go to war and fire these guns, and it had 6 50 cal machine guns, which for its time was great hitting power. So the P-40 is often related to as the A-10 Warthog of its day. And it did. It saw service throughout every theatre of the war. Landing it had its... any pilot who's flown tailwheel aeroplanes know that they can have a mind of their own. They can be like a drunken supermarket trolley. And so what you've got to do, it's like riding a horse. I'm not a horse rider, but they tell me if you don't ride the horse will ride you. And these airplanes are the same. So landing is probably one of the more critical parts of it. If you let it get away from you, it's only going to get worse. But landing the P-40 was not too bad for a tailwheel aeroplane. I've got to say, it's all, and it's probably through familiarity, it's probably my favourite of all these aeroplanes I've flown. I've done more time in the P-40, I've felt more at home in it, more comfortable in it. So next comes the Spitfire, and of course the Spitfire, it's an iconic aeroplane. We all know that it won the World War II, etc., etc. If you listen to the British propaganda, but it certainly was. There's no doubt the Spitfire is this iconic British aeroplane. And I said the P-40 is a 37 Chevy. Well, the Spitfire is probably a 1937 Jaguar or something. It has no ergonomics in the cockpit. One of the most important gauges is your boost gauge, and it's the smallest one hidden away in one corner of it. So you're playing around with power. I can imagine at Messerschmitt power, which was full forward, but it just doesn't. It's got this huge, big round turn and slip indicator, the same one that's in a Tiger Moth. Probably one of the least important instruments in the middle of the cockpit, where you can't dodge it. When you get airborne and you want to bring the gear up, it's hand off the throttle, onto the control column, this hand over to the lever, which grates itself through to get the gear up. And so it's quite often, if you hear a Spitfire take off and as the gear comes up, the power drops back a little bit because the pilot hasn't done up the throttle friction enough. Takes his hand off the throttle and goes. The fuel system is a basket case. It's got tanks here, there and everywhere and selectors. So it's just, all I can say, it's a typically British aircraft with no ergonomics. However, flying it's quite different. It's a thoroughbred. It's if you look at the wing on the Spitfire, it's got quite a sharp leading edge on it. quite a sharp leading edge, which gives quite a vigorous stall, shall I say. So it'll hang on and you get a little bit of buffet, but when it stalls, it really lets go on you. In aerobatics, its elevators are ridiculously light. So in airplanes, we talk about control harmony, and it's all to do with strengths and what have you, but we talk about the elevators should be, or the aileron should be this number 2 on a level of effort. The elevator should be number 4, and the pedal should be number 6. And that's a nicely balanced airplane. The Spitfire, the elevators are 0. They're as light as a feather. The ailerons work through chains and cables and goodness knows what else, and they almost go clunk, 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 backwards and forwards, and are quite heavy. And its roll rate is what we would call pedestrian. So for a purely aerobatic aeroplane, it's not that nice to fly. But of course we get over that because it's a Spitfire. And we all know that it acquitted itself quite well 80 years back. Landing a Spitfire, with tailwheel aeroplanes, common misconception is that if the undercarriage is narrow or close together, it's really bad to land. Well, Spitfire's got a pretty narrow undercarriage, and it's beautiful to land. It's also got a nice long chassis on it, if you like, where the tail wheel is way back behind the main wheels. So you put it on the ground, and it just tracks beautifully. I don't think I've had a bad landing out of the Spitfire. So it's pretty nice, the Spitfire. Focke-Wulf, yeah, well. When it came to fly the Focke-Wulf, I said I'd gotten hold of Steve Hinton, who gave me no real information. And so I spent a lot of time reading about it and sitting in it. And the first thing about the Focke-Wulf is it's a 1940s design. And so it's just a little leap ahead of everything. It's an electric aeroplane, and that everything in it is operated electrically. So the Spitfire, for example, has pneumatics, hydraulics, and electrics. The Focke-Wulf has electrics. The cockpit layout and the ergonomics are just bang on. Everything you want is it's just right there. The instrument layout is different, but very, shall I say, Teutonic, very logical. And for example, to get airborne in the Focke-Wulf and getting the gear up, so you got your hand up here on the throttle, you get yourself airborne, you go reach down there, there's a little button, and that's the gear coming up. Gear down, and a button next to it. It is really, really good. The first day that I flew the Focke-Wulf, I thought, right, we've talked about this enough, eventually you've got to get up and do it. And we had no idea where we should set the trims. And so the engineer down at Omark says, we'll set them all neutral, and then we know where to go. So I got brave enough at Omark and hit the taps in this thing, and the first thing I found out is that if you use too much power too early in the takeoff, you run out of right rudder authority. So instead of taking off over there, we eventually took off over here somewhere, got the thing airborne, and at about 500 feet, I was thinking to myself, well, I can't say what I was really thinking. I was thinking, golly gosh, what have you done to yourself, Frank? The trims were just totally out of kilter. I was hard across to the right with the ailerons. I had a boot full of left rudder on. I thought, this is not good. This is not good, and because those trims you can't adjust them. They're adjusted on the ground. The elevator trim you could adjust. And so I got over the airfield and flew around for a little while and thought, oh well, we've got to do something about it. So I went across the Woodburn where they've got about 2 miles of grass both ways, length and breadth, and managed to get a landing out of it. And so we went and did a couple more circuits. And so I got brave enough to head back to Omark. And I got over here to Omark and selected the gear down, and guess what? There was one red light left. And one of the main gears hadn't come down. I thought, oh, this is not so good. And so I talked to the guys on the ground, and they said, oh, have you tried this, have you tried that? And they said, well, have you tried the emergency gear? Now, I'd spent 2 days in that cockpit going through all the emergency procedures, and there's a little lever just up here for the emergency gear lever, and I'm thinking, where's that emergency gear? I can't find it. And what had happened is it also, where the emergency gear was, there was a lever for the fuel. And when the fuel was turned on, it conveniently covered up the emergency gear lever. Anyway, we found that and pulled that, nothing happened. Oh crap, what are we going to do now? And then one of the engineers says, well, turn all the electrics off and turn them on again. And so we did that, and it was just like a Microsoft reset, gear came down. And so they put it up on the jacks to try, and I think they had to do 20 gear cycles, and finally the gear stuck up. And the German engineer was there, says, there's a wiggly wire in the gear release thing. So we fixed that. Flying that aircraft is, I subsequently had a chat to Steve Hinton about Focke-Wulfs when he was out here flying the Mosquito a couple of years ago, because he's flown one of these replica ones, Flugwork replicas, and he's also flown the real McCoy, which I think there's 1 or 2 flying in the world. And he says, well, I don't know what the Flugwork guys did, but they lost something. He says, when he first got the opportunity to fly it, he thought, wow, here's this Mustang killer, I'm going to enjoy this. And he went flying, and he came back and says, what a piece of shit that was. And he says, subsequently, when he flew the real one, he said, chalk and cheese. He says, 2 aeroplanes which are essentially built the same, how can they fly so differently? So somewhere in the translation, they've lost something. So it's a very neutral aeroplane. The controls are, anybody driven a Volkswagen Beetle and tried to find the gears? It's like sloshing around in a steering, making a apple pie or something. So that's the Focke-Wulf. It's got no feel to the controls at all. As I said, normally these things, you can feel the controls. The Focke-Wulf is just neutral. It's got quite a short control column, so it's the trim in it. I mean, the Germans got their trim right. Is you can fly it at 100 knots and you can fly it at 300 knots, and you don't touch the elevator trim at all. But it's funny. It's got and I'm not sure if it's this aeroplane, I'm sure it is, it's got what I call a cross-coupling, is you go to do a pitching manoeuvre, like a loop or something, and suddenly it goes into a yaw. And that's just not right. It shouldn't be like that. So it's an unusual aeroplane to fly. And landing, I think I must have flown 30 or 40 hours in the thing. I think I can remember one good landing. It's got a very harsh undercarriage. I tried to 3-point it and it just bloody bounced back into the sky. And so I've reverted to just a nice tail-low wheeler, and occasionally you get it right, but it's just not a nice aeroplane. Fortunately, the owner's not here to listen to me. On to the Mustang. There's a reason why Mustang pilots walk with a swagger, and there's a reason why they call it the Cadillac of the skies. Once again, it's a later design than the Kitty Hawk and the Spitfire. It's an automatic aeroplane. You just go flying, and it's got a thing that looks after the radiator, another thing that looks after the oil cooler. All you got to do is go fast, go slow, pretty much. It's got perfect control harmony, if that's what it just feels right. It's got a really great performance. And thinking that we're flying these things, they haven't got a ton of guns and they haven't got a ton of ammunition and stuff in it, so we're flying them pretty light. Mind you, we're not using full power either. But the Mustang, you point it downhill and it's off like a startled rat. It's aerobatics. It's just delightful. The only unusual thing about it is its landing. And once again, I talk about undercarriage geometry and what have you, and people think, look at that undercarriage on that Mustang, it's a big, wide undercarriage. Gee, that must be great. Wrong. It's actually quite twitchy to land. And my theory is, because the undercarriage is so wide, if you get a little bit of a sway on that leg out there, it's got quite a big moment. And so it actually affects it quite a lot. So the Mustang can be a little bit twitchy on landing. But all in all, it's just a really, really nice aeroplane. Yak 3. So my opportunity to fly to Yak 3 is quite early in my career, so I had a lot of Kitty Hawk time and a little bit of Spitfire time. And the cockpit, it's Russian, you know. One of the biggest things about the cockpit is FBRC, the flipping big Russian clock. It's about this size, and it's in every Russian aeroplane I've seen. The L-39 has it, the Yak-52 has it, the Nanchang has it, so all those Eastern Bloc aeroplanes have to have this big Russian clock in it. It's controls, I think they stole them out of a submarine somewhere. It's got not little wheels, it's got wheels here for the trim and wheels here for the radiators and such like. It's got pneumatic systems, and it's got a valve down here and a valve down there and an emergency valve back here. It's just not a ergonomic aeroplane, but it goes like a startled rat. And you think about it, if you compare the size of it, P-40, 7,000 or 8,000 pounds with Allison in it, the little Yak, 5,000 pounds, about half the wing area with the same amount of power, it really, really goes. It's just got, for what it is, a stonking performance. Controls, beautiful. It's just beautifully balanced. You don't have to, like the Focke-Wulf, you don't have to trim it at all. You get the thing airborne, off you go. Landing speed or flat out, you just don't touch the control trims whatsoever. It's got a super roll rate, almost as good as a P-40, so it's just a delight for doing aerobatics. You can whip it around the sky and do quick rolls and theory turns and loops and things in it. It just wants to go. And landing, it's not too bad. So the Yak-3 is just a nice little aeroplane. It's just a little hot rod. And if you see them racing around at the air shows, those guys haven't got a swagger, but they've got a smile. So we come to the P-39, and that was, as I said, a little bit of a mystery. And eventually you get yourself brave enough to line up on the runway and hit the taps and off you go. And my first takeoff, and that was quite memorable because the governor wasn't quite rightly set up, and the old propeller was trying to go faster than the aeroplane. Anyway, we sorted that out, and then we had undercarriage problems with it. It's got an electrical undercarriage, and the switches weren't working correctly, and we did numerous flights where I couldn't get the gear fully up, and or it would get up. Fortunately, it came down every time, but eventually we got it all sorted out, and pretty much, what I should say, the cockpit. It's an unusual cockpit. Instead of an instrument panel like this, it's got an instrument panel like that. It's American, so all of the gauges and switches and things are all familiar, but it's an aeroplane with doors on it, so you can lean out, put the window down, lean out the door like a 37 Chevy. If you read the war record about it, they say it was a poor performer. Well, to my mind, it was just a copy of the Yak-3. It's a little aeroplane, it's got heaps of power, and it really was delightful to fly. So that was an all too brief but a very memorable experience. And finally we get to the Corsair. As I said, I'd looked in awe at this aeroplane for many, many years. And the first impression of the Corsair is a bit like the old wildebeest over there. It's big. She's a big horse. An old guy like me almost needs a ladder to get into it. There's a secret, but I won't give it away. It's got a big American cockpit in it, so the gauges and switches and things are all pretty familiar. And the positioning is very good. It's got all your flying controls, your flaps and your gear and your throttle and what have you in your left hand, and all the electrical stuff is a nice panel down the right hand side. One thing about the cockpit is you drop anything, it's gone forever because it disappears into the bilges, which are about 6 feet below the seat. And our one, it doesn't have a floor in it, so literally if you drop something, you've got to turn it upside down and rattle it to get it back. Perhaps that's the naval heritage of it. It's delightful. It's light controls, so it's a big airplane, no hydraulics in it, but all the controls have got what we call servo tabs on it, so it's as light as a feather to fly, fast or slow. Hardly need to touch the trims at all. Engine handling, it's pretty straightforward, so it's got this big grunting 2800 engine in it, which runs just delightfully. Compared to the engine in the Focke-Wulf, which is a similar power, the Focke-Wulf has got a Russian engine in it. It's like a Russian tractor. The Corsair is like must be an American tractor, which is well developed and tuned. It just purrs along. Funny enough, is we all relate the Corsair to having a great performance, but in my experience, it's actually not a great performer. And during an aerobatic sequence, you've got to be really quite careful to maintain your energy. I compare it almost to P40. You fly to P40, you have to work a little bit on maintaining energy during a sequence, but in the Corsair you've got to be really watching your speeds and heights and things, which compared to the Mustangs has got almost an excess of power. However, having said that, it's still delightful to fly, and landing has got this big springy or big long oleo undercarriage designed for landing on carriers, and they soak up the worst landing that anybody could do, I think. I haven't had a bad landing in the Corsair yet. I should mention one other, which is not a World War II jobbo that I've flown, and that is the little L-39 Albatross jet. So we go back to the cockpit, it's also Russian, but they learnt a little bit during the years. It's still got that big Russian clock in the middle of the instrument panel, but flying it is a delight. I liken it very much to the Mustang, whereas the harmony is just perfect. And it loops and rolls and does everything that you want to do. And it's got air conditioning. So that's about my lot, folks. As I say, I consider myself very fortunate to have had the opportunity to fly all these aeroplanes, and I've got to say thanks to the owners who've entrusted me. And yeah, sometimes you get lucky. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. No, that was fantastic.